Hello, I am Tom Dunlop, and I'm going to talk to you today about how you can get started with automation. So, a little bit of background about myself before we get started. So, I'm a lawyer by trade, very much started out as a private practice lawyer and then moved in-house relatively early on, finishing my in-house career as a legal director for several software businesses. And then ultimately, I founded my own legal tech business called Surmise, which is where I'm currently the CEO. So the reason I kind of briefly touch on my background and why it's relevant is that particularly kind of being an in-house lawyer in the software industry, is I got quite a unique insight into being given the freedom to try and automate elements of the legal process. And actually this was actively encouraged in the businesses that I work for. So today really is about trying to break through the noise of legal tech, a lot of different products out there, and to really focus on the important thing, which is more about how do you even get started. So we've broken this down into kind of four sections, really. Number one is, well, does automation matter? And why does it matter? The second is if it does matter so much, then why haven't we done this already? What are the blockers and the challenges people face? Thirdly, we'll look at, well, what does good look like? Successful automation, what does that actually look like in terms of a practical day-to-day use? And then finally, which is, I guess, the key is where can you start and how can you start implementing legal tech? So in terms of whether automation matters, automation, in my view, is critical for the legal sector. I mean, simply put, it just makes us do our work faster and smarter. And in an industry which is dependent on your time being billed or a cost being applied to your time, and ultimately a client paying for that time, the ability to do that in a more efficient way, a more effective way, has got to be a good thing. Now, whether you're an in-house lawyer or whether you're a private practice lawyer, there's always pressure to be either a business leader and a kind of decision maker on the in-house side, or certainly be more than just a legal advisor and be more of a commercial advisor to your clients in private practice. So using automation to kind of alleviate the low value tasks that ultimately don't appear valuable to the business or clients and helps you focus on those areas and give the true value out to the clients or internal stakeholders. I mean, automate any of these processes that's wasting that time has got to be a good way forward. I think it's also true that tasks that can be automated are probably not actually the tasks that anyone really wants to spend time on, that anyone believed that when they trained to be a lawyer, they were going to spend time on. And so successful automation, in my view, kind of means that you're not spending your time doing more administrative, process-driven tasks, and it actually allows you to focus on really what it means to be a lawyer. And I think it's fair to say that pretty much anyone who has kind of experienced the day-to-day life of as a lawyer can recognize a number of tasks that they do day to day that kind of fit into this mold. Certainly from my experience, there's a large proportion of time spent on these types of tasks. I mean, looking at specifically at contracts, which is the area that Surmise sits in, I don't think anyone really enjoys doing contract review. It's certainly not the best time of expert legal time. And I don't think from a client perspective either, and using my experience as an in-house lawyer, the time that lawyers take to actually understand what's in the contract never felt like it was a productive cost or true value for money. But ultimately, it's a necessary evil to be able to give that more commercial advice and actually give the overall picture as to say, what are the top 5 risks of this contract? You can't get to that answer unless you spend the time to understand the whole contract. So really, the whole point about automation is to find the balance between the time and cost of reviewing the contracts and then actually matching that with what the client expectation or end result is to be that commercial or business legal advisor. In terms of the numbers that sit behind this, and these are our estimates, but based on the data that we've seen to date, and also how quick we think we can make contract reviews using our software, is that just in the UK alone, the time wasted on contract reviews amounts to about £2.3 billion. Now, this is a calculation that we've based on the number of solicitors who do contract reviews, the average time that people take in terms of actually doing contract reviews on their weekly basis from these target number of solicitors, and then the average time we can save using a product such as Surmise on those contract reviews. And that's how we get to this kind of huge figure of £2.3 billion. Now, ultimately, that's money that could ultimately be spent elsewhere, or alternatively money that maybe can't even be billed today because it's being written off and ultimately could be profitable billing going forward. Introducing some level of automation as well can also free up junior lawyers' time and actually allow them to get to more complicated work. It allows them to genuinely upskill rather than relying on them to essentially be the kind of administrative arm of a business. And we hear this a lot, which kind of goes hand in hand with this, is that actually using tech to do these kind of lower value tasks can actually gamify the experience. And particularly for the younger generation, it can actually be a really effective retention tool. and it can actually make the job a little bit more enjoyable. It can mean instead of physically wading through paper, they can actually have some kind of interactive web application. It's the same job, much quicker, but actually much more enjoyable at the same time. So I guess, dealing with kind of important points and kind of summarizing what I've just said, the three things that we say, and there's client pressure to automate, there's market pressure, there's client pressure driving us to that at any event. Secondly, it does save time and it does save money on, and it allows you to free yourself up for the kind of better value tasks, which is ultimately kind of hand in hand with the client and the kind of business pressure. And then thirdly, which is slightly different, but actually automation can make the job more enjoyable. It can be an effective retention tool and actually attract people to either your firm or your in-house team if you're using this effectively. So that all sounds great. And so I guess the big question is, well, if all of these benefits exist, then why hasn't it kind of been really adopted? Because we know there's a big noise in the market about the amount of legal products that have been brought out, but not really a lot of them are being adopted, very widely adopted. So to answer that question, I guess we've kind of honed in on a few different points. Firstly, I mean, there's certainly time constraints. I mean, I recognize being a lawyer, it's a frantic day-to-day job, and it's a very reactive service as well. So a lot of the time you have a client query, whether that's kind of internal or as an external client, and they want to react to something quickly. They need your advice, something's come up, but then you've got to provide that as well as balance the existing workload. It's not really a project-based role. It's very much kind of day-to-day and can be quite reactive. So certainly when some products are just introduced to this mix to kind of be adopted by lawyers, it's not a surprise necessarily that they don't get adopted that quick, because it's got to balance that kind of workload with the day-to-day and the reactive, which ultimately takes the priority. I guess secondly, on top of that, there's also no room for error. And I think this is quite a unique thing to legal services, which is that legal advice, I mean, it's a very advisory-based service. You're trusted for your opinion, and a lot of the times, the reason you're being paid is for that expert knowledge. So, and me being a lawyer, I'm also a big control freak, and so having almost the perception of giving away that control and relying on some kind of machine to do parts of that job can sometimes be scary for lawyers. And I think this is the fine balance between what are you trying to automate, and it comes back to the whole point of this topic, which is we're not thinking products can just come in and replace what we do. What we're hoping is that the products can automate the low value tasks and really focus our mind on the actual valuable legal work that we're tasked with as lawyers. I think building on this, not only does it take longer to implement, but I think the other thing is that a lot of products actually drive changes in behavior. So not only is it, you've got to be conscious that it's correct, but it's also saying, well, I know what you do today, but actually we want to change that behavior and adopt a new system, whether that's a new web application or an entirely new process. It kind of forces that change. So it becomes quite a big change management piece. And again, at Surmise, the reason that we built a Microsoft Word add-in is because, we recognize that lawyers spend a lot of time in Microsoft Word. So trying to get people to do contract reviews, albeit more efficiently, but outside of that norm, we recognize is going to be a challenge and it's not going to be widely adopted. So it's definitely a problem and a hurdle to get over with any new product. And I think lastly, and most importantly, as to why these technology may have not been adopted is obviously the expense as well. And I think automation historically has involved extensive systems, expensive implementations, training, and probably only available to the much bigger firms, for example, or much bigger in-house legal teams that have dedicated personnel to maybe work with them. I mean, I'll come on to the reason why I don't believe that's an issue going forward with some of the products that are coming out there, in particular ones obviously like Surmise itself. But we get that expense is also a big hurdle to adoption. So moving on to, I guess, point 3 and taking that into consideration, I guess, where have we seen it work well, or where have we seen it not work well particularly? I think whether you're working in-house or private practice, there's always challenges to automation. There's also always challenges that automation can help. So I think you're always going to find a use case that will be relevant for some form of automation. And really, as we've touched on before, the whole point of automation, in my view, is just to reduce the low value, time intensive tasks. It's not to replace, part of your day job that is actually your advisory bit or the bit that you train for. So if you look at any task that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, it's low value, it's time intensive, it's repetitive, that's definitely the kind of perfect task to look to automate with. And a good example of that, for example, at Surmise, is that contract reviews themselves. I mean, no one really enjoys doing them for one, but also the kind of time, the bulk of the time of a contract review is actually finding the information and then layering your advice on top of that. So we found with a number of our clients that we can essentially create a contract review process that's 85% quicker than traditional methods, which is a huge time saving. And the bulk of that is all, as I was saying, basically taken from actually finding the information first, actioning it, and then your time is really just spent interpreting that and presenting that back to the client. So it's a good example of how a task could take typically a long period of time, and probably not consider highly valuable work as well, where clients can constantly ask the question of, is this a good use of lawyers' time, can actually turn into a very effective service for a client and a very cost-effective way of billing a client too. Elaborating a little bit further on kind of where we've seen it work well as well is also about resurfacing information from completed or signed documents. And I'm pretty much all lawyers watching this will have read through a contract. They probably only just decided to reread the contract to find another clause later on, or the in-house world in particular, you're constantly living and breathing these terms. So saving time in the initial review is one step, but actually revisiting that contract and essentially extracting or resurfacing that information is also equally as important. So what we do, and we built a number of different tools within the product to assist with this as well, but simple calendars to record renewal dates with email reminders, and also a feature that we've called Contract Insights, which is basically designed for that exact purpose, where you can basically ask questions of your contracts and get the answer. There's no need to filter or sort or search or go to your filing system, reopen the PDF and reread the contract. It's kind of that instant resurfacing of information and getting answers to those questions that you're likely to ask day to day. Now, again, the time saving on that in terms of a task is huge, even though it's kind of past that initial document review. For those in private practice, I think another thing to bear in mind in terms of where it's worked well is that automation can actually be a real differentiator and actually help set yourself apart from the competition and win more business. So we're hearing this more and more from people pitching for work, whether it's in-house clients or SMEs, and having an edge that they use legal technology and actually showing this as a proactive way of either engaging with the client or delivering legal advice. It's starting to see those kind of law firms gain new traction with clients, gain new clients and take them from other businesses, because businesses naturally want to work with more forward-thinking firms. And ultimately it comes back to the point before, they believe they're getting more for the money if they're getting some kind of service or product wrapped around that service as well. So a couple of things that we've done again to assist this type of side of it with the more private practice side is we have things like shareable links, which kind of work the way as a DocuSign, where you can essentially share a contract summary, but it's a very interactive summary, branded as the law firms. So they don't just get an email with a really long email and a kind of covering advice note. What they get is essentially a web page where you've got a summary of the key contract terms on the left-hand side, their contract on the right, and you can kind of scroll between the two, and it's all very automated, interactive, and engaging. So now that's going to be a huge time saving in terms of automation, but actually, when we talk about automation, it's also worth bearing in mind that, you can look for easy wins with time saving, but actually client engagement is another piece that you could automate, and it might not be a huge time saving, but from a revenue generation perspective, it's something worth bearing in mind. So automation can encapsulate a number of different areas, and I think that's worth bearing in mind when we talk about where to start. So I guess the final question is, well, if we know that tech's important, and we know that it's important for the future of the industry, we know it's important for the future and retention of talent, and we also know why, I guess, there's barriers and how you can address them, then I guess it's which bits do you actually look to automate? When we think of it as kind of a three-stage process. And this isn't meant to be prescriptive, it's not too detailed, it's hopefully quite a light touch way that you could approach that question. And so essentially the first stage we look at is identify your workload. Now that sounds quite straightforward, but an example is when, for example, I worked in-house, I developed a playbook, and the playbook was essentially the areas that I would generally work on day to day. So it could be intellectual property, it could be contract management, could be corporate governance, could be property and leases, HR, employment, could be any of those areas. And then you kind of break down individually in those areas the tasks that you do. So for contract management, it might be the creation of contracts, the review of contracts, the approval, the signature, the storage and management of those contracts. And you kind of list out all your day-to-day tasks. And really what's important for this is definitely the more granular you get, the better. And when you've kind of looked at, separating out your workload and your day-to-day tasks into different areas, the next step is then to essentially categorize those on a graph. And so we developed a graph which is really straightforward to use, where on the vertical axis you've got time versus mental capacity. And this is more for the in-house world. And then on the horizontal axis, you've got risk versus value. So the idea with this is that if you're spending your time efficiently, then really the tasks that you do day to day should all be in the bottom right or the bottom left of the graph, because essentially that's high value or high risk items, but requiring more mental capacity than just pure time. If you're looking at plotting these on the graph and you're noticing things that are certainly in the very high time category and potentially more in the central part of the graph where it's lower risk and lower value, I mean, these are the natural areas to start automation. And some tips to help you along this way is, when you're plotting these on the graph, really think granularly. Don't just think, for example, contract review as one area. What you could actually do for contract review is think about, well, how do I get instructed? What's the process for getting instructed? How do I find the information in the contract? How do I action that? Do the markup? How do I then share that or send that back to the client or whoever instructed me? How do I approve any final version? How do I sign it? How do I store it? How do I resurface that information? So actually, contract review has become, a number of different more granular areas that would all sit separately on this graph. And also then when you're plotting these out, just think about those day-to-day really repetitive tasks that you do. And it could be anything, but for example, it could be walking around the office physically to try and get signatures from 3 different people. And you remembered a week ago that you spent half a day trying to track down people for a signature. Repetitive tasks that take a lot of time are the perfect place to start automation. For private practice, we believe we can do a very similar look at graph. So on this graph, on the vertical axis, what we have is whether you're considered an expensive resource versus specialist advisor. And then on the horizontal axis, it's areas looking at profitable billing versus basically time written off. So again, the areas for the sweet spot for law firms in terms of where you should be spending your time, and this should be done potentially by department, is you need to be considered a specialist advisor and very much profitable billing. So anything in that bottom left-hand corner in particular is where you want to be spending the time and where all work should really be sitting. Anything that's plotted, whether it be central or certainly towards the far right of the graph, where essentially you're just writing off time, if you've got a lot of time written off and the perception from the client is that, it's not really a specialist advisor, it's more of just an expensive external resource, that is ripe for automation. You should look at ways that you can kind of start to automate those tasks. An example of this, and we hear this a lot, just to kind of contextualize how you can bring this graph to life, contract review is one of those areas where clients often say, I wanted you to review a contract. This should really only take you an hour. How's it costing me £1,000 to review a contract? Maybe what they don't know in the background is that to actually find the information and to generate a red flag review or a top 5 risks, you have to go through that process of understanding the full contract, resurface the information, then prioritize them to present them back to the client. But actually, the client expectation of that is that you're going to be an expensive external resource, and you're probably going to have to write off some of that time. So finding a way of cutting down the time to be able to get the answer has to be a natural place to start. And it does come back to this balance of, you need to balance the time it spends to do the task versus the perception of the client and how profitable that billing actually becomes. So once you plotted these in the matrix and you looked at the risk, value, mental capacity, and time, or in the case of private practice, whether it's profitable billing versus time written off, being an expensive resource versus specialist advisor, you then really got the tools to actually make you start automation. And this is when you start to go to the market and you look at tools that do those specific tasks. The reason we kind of say go to this route as opposed to acquiring a really large system, for example, that proposes to do a lot, is that until you do this exercise, you're not entirely sure, or you won't know exactly how you're going to even implement that system. Because it may be that a number of the areas on the graph that you've plotted are actually process driven, rather than what a product might be able to solve in terms of creating a contract or something along those lines. So really plotting those tasks, whether it be a process or not, is important to do first before you can really go to the market and look for those products. An example I gave before about walking around the room for, for obtaining signatures, it might sound quite basic, but a lot of time is wasted in that approval workflow and that signature. So tools such as eSignature is a great place to go because it's cost effective to implement, it's easy to implement, and it solves a genuine need that is both not considered valuable time and also certainly just a lot of time taken to track down people to actually get them over the line. Similarly with contract review and surmise, obviously we make that much easier and we can save about 85% of the time taken to review contracts. So if that's one of those areas, whether it's private practice or in-house, how much time you're spending actually reviewing the contracts is kind of the important bit. And when you balance that with the actual value or risk that's coming out the other end of that, if that's not balanced, then again, it's a natural area to look at solutions, obviously, such as Surmise, to be able to help automation and start getting on your journey to automate these tasks. I think in terms of dealing with some of the other barriers as well, it's also worth noting that, don't be afraid to go out there and look at tools that are more dedicated to certain areas. We find, and we get a lot of comments about how easy Surmise is to use and also implement. There's a lot of kind of different tech tools and the different products coming to the market that are having the same type of user interface and the same type of specialism in these areas that mean that no longer becomes a barrier. And some of them, in the case of Surmise, for example, actually there's a pre-set number of clauses or contract types already made. So technically from day one, there's value that can be had. I think it's also I'm also keen to stress the kind of lengthy period of time to implement and distract you from the day to day. So it does depend on the products, but if you found an area where, there's a definite area of automation and a product that you're looking at won't disrupt that process and require some larger change management piece, then really, the time to implement and the time to change can be reduced massively. And I think that's a huge hurdle to get over if you're looking for a successful adoption of a technology product. So this leads me to kind of guess the final thoughts, and I think if I was to summarize, my key takeaway piece of advice, it's technology is great, but it needs to be combined with a process. And I think that when you look at process and technology together, and you start to really plot this on the graph as we've discovered, then once you've narrowed that down, just give it a go. I think there is a big fear about technology, and I think it's led to this reluctance to adopt certain technology. But I think once you've really narrowed it down, get on that journey and then iterate from there. We speak to a number of firms that started this journey a few years ago and they may have made a mistake with acquiring a very heavy, expensive tool that thought was going to change the world, and maybe it hasn't. But actually, the learnings that have been gained from that mean that now they're in a position where a lot of things are automated. They can win client tenders, for example, because they've got this technology that can improve client engagement as well as internal efficiencies. And actually, just going down this journey and actually adopting some technology in those areas, those obvious areas, really start to get you on that iteration journey and get you to the promised land sooner. So I hope this has been useful. And obviously, if there's any questions at all, please do get in contact. So my email is tom@surmise.it. And I'm more than happy to have any conversations about the graphs or about approaches to different technology. Please feel free to reach out. And thank you for your time.